$10. That's what it cost her to buy the building she now calls home. I'm gonna say that again, because it doesn't land the first time. $10. One bill handed over on a gravel lot for a rusted metal shed that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard, not a neighborhood. She didn't smile when she handed the money over. She told the man who sold it to her later that her hands were shaking too hard to count the bill twice. Not from cold, from the strange, quiet fear of spending the very last money she had on something that might turn out to be worthless. By the following winter, she was sleeping inside it warm, with lights that worked, water at the door, and a heater running on its lowest setting because the room held its own heat. None of that is the part that stays with me. The part that stays with me is what she did to the rust. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For privacy, her name and exact location are withheld in this account. The techniques, materials, and costs described here are drawn from documented practices used by real off-grid and homeless builders across the country, several of which we've covered in past videos on this channel. This is one version of a pattern that repeats more often than most of us realize. Here's the question you're probably already asking, because it's the obvious one. Why didn't she just go to a shelter? Why not wait for a housing voucher, a rooming house, a government program? The honest answer is she tried. Waitlists for housing assistance regularly run over a year, sometimes closer to 2. Single-room occupancy housing, the cheap, no questions asked kind that used to exist in nearly every American city, has largely disappeared since the 1970s. What's left often requires a deposit, an ID, proof of income. For someone without those in order, the system isn't slow. It's simply not available yet. She spent close to 4 months moving between a car, a friend's couch, and nights outside before she stopped waiting for a door that wasn't going to open on her timeline. It was an adventure. It was someone doing math on a bad set of options and picking the one she could build with her own hands. So she didn't wait for the system to catch up. She built something in the meantime. And what she built is worth understanding in detail because none of it is magic and almost all of it is repeatable. The shed came off the back of a scrap hauler's flatbed, corrugated steel, roughly 8 feet by 10, and it was in bad shape. Not needs some work, bad. Actually failing. The galvanized coating that protects steel from rust had worn off years earlier, and rust had eaten clean through the metal in 2 places, holes big enough to put a fist through. The door was a sheet of plywood hanging on one working hinge. No floor, no windows, just a metal box that had spent years rotting in a field. The hauler wanted $15 for it. She had 10. He took it. Someone standing nearby looked at the thing being unloaded and said, only half joking, that she'd just bought herself a coffin. She said the comment stung more than she let on because for a moment, looking at the rust and the missing door, she wondered if he was right. He wasn't wrong about how it looked. He was wrong about what it actually was. Here's the part almost nobody understands until they see it happen. Rust isn't just dirty metal, it's iron dying. Iron atoms on the surface react with oxygen and water, breaking down into that reddish flaking scale. And it doesn't stop on its own. Rust is porous, so it holds moisture, which feeds more rust underneath it, eating the metal from the outside in. The normal move is to scrap it. She didn't have that option, so she looked for another one and found it in a small bottle of phosphoric acid rust converter, the kind sold at almost any hardware store for a few dollars. You brush it directly onto rusted metal, and something happens that looks almost like a trick. The acid reacts with the iron oxide and converts it chemically into iron phosphate. That's not the same substance. Iron phosphate is hard, dark, and it bonds to the steel instead of eating into it. It doesn't flake. It doesn't hold water. She wire-brushed the loose rust off first, 2 full days of it, arms aching, hands raw under a pair of dish gloves. At one point, she said, she sat down on the gravel and cried, not because the work was hard, but because for the first time in months, she was doing something that felt like hers instead of something happening to her. Then she brushed the converter on. Where it touched bare rust, the color changed in front of her, orange turning black. The surface going from something that looked like it was rotting to something that looked closer to cast iron. That single step is why the rest of the build was even possible. You cannot insulate, seal, or weatherproof a wall that's actively dissolving. She stopped the decay before she built anything on top of it. The 2 fist-sized holes were next. She didn't have money for new sheet metal, so she used scrap aluminum flashing instead, doubled over for strength, cut a few inches larger than each hole, and riveted into place. Every edge got sealed with silicone caulking to keep water out completely. A coat of rust-inhibiting primer went over the patches, followed by exterior paint in a plain muted color from a hardware store's discount mist and shelf, paint mixed wrong for someone else's order and sold off cheap. From a distance, the shed no longer looked abandoned. It looked like a small shed somebody was actively taking care of. Not impressive, just alive again. She said that was the first afternoon she let herself imagine actually living there, instead of just surviving there. Here's something most people miss about surviving cold weather in a structure like this. The ground underneath you is often more dangerous than the air around you. Your body sits around 98 degrees. Bare ground in winter can sit well below freezing. Heat moves in a straight line from warm to cold, through your spine and hips all night long, and no blanket stops it, because blankets only slow heat rising off your body into the air. They do nothing about the cold surface directly beneath you. She'd learned that already from nights outside before the shed, waking every hour with her hips aching from the cold coming up through whatever she was lying on. She built a raised floor so she'd never feel that again. Wooden pallets, salvaged and screwed together, form the base. A layer of heavy plastic sheeting went over them to block moisture from rising up through the wood. On top of that, rigid foam board, pulled from a construction site dumpster with the foreman's permission. Plywood, bought secondhand for $20, went down last, cut to size by hand. That floor alone changed what the building was. Before it, this was a metal box sitting over frozen dirt. After it, stepping inside meant stepping onto something solid, dry, and no longer stealing the warmth out of her body with every hour she stood on it. The walls followed the same logic. More scavenged foam board, this time the kind with a foil layer on both sides, pressure fit between wooden furring strips screwed horizontally across the interior at even spacing. Every seam got taped shut. The ceiling got a double layer since heat rises and escapes through the roof first. This part of the build sounds almost boring described out loud, and that's exactly why it matters more than anything visually dramatic that comes later. A huge share of total warmth lost from a space this size escapes through uninsulated walls and ceilings before it ever reaches a door or window. Skip this step, and every heater afterward is fighting a losing battle. Once the interior panels went up over the foam, something changed that surprised her. The space went quiet, not silent. She could still hear the world outside, but the layers, metal, air gap, foam, Wood had turned a tin box into something closer to a sealed room than a shed. She's described sitting inside it that first quiet evening and feeling for a few minutes like an ordinary person in an ordinary room, which was a feeling she hadn't had in a long time. The first night she slept there with no heat running at all, it was in the low 20s outside. In the morning, the thermometer inside read closer to 40. 17 degrees of difference, created entirely by insulation, before a single heat source was ever turned on. She'd been watching for weeks for a small, indoor-rated propane heater, the kind ice fishermen use, with a built-in oxygen sensor that shuts off if air quality drops, and a tip-over switch for safety. New, these run around $70 or $80. She found a used one at a thrift store for a fraction of that, tested it outside first to confirm it worked safely, then brought it in. Inside that well-sealed, well-insulated box, a heater built for a flimsy plywood ice shanty was overkill in the best possible way. Within about 40 minutes of lighting it, the interior temperature climbed past 60 degrees. She turned it down, and it held steady in the high 50s. She kept a small hinged window cracked open anytime the heater ran. Propane combustion produces carbon monoxide, and she knew it. She had also bought a battery-powered carbon monoxide detector for a few dollars. Because ventilation and detection aren't optional steps, they're the difference between staying warm and not waking up. She said she checked that detector's battery obsessively at first, until trusting the room became something closer to normal. Light came next, built from a small secondhand solar panel, cracked in one corner but still functional, mounted at an angle on the roof, wired through a basic charge controller into a used marine battery, and from there into low-voltage LED strip lighting run around the ceiling. The color of that light isn't warm or flattering. It's the flat blue-white of cheap LED strip lighting, closer to a hospital hallway than a living room. But the first night it switched on, what mattered wasn't the color. It was that a room existed that had light in it after dark, without needing to hold up a phone flashlight to see her own hands. She said she sat under that light for almost an hour that first night, doing nothing in particular, just because she could. Water was the hardest problem since, unlike heat or light, no single product fixed it. The solution was almost entirely mechanical. An 80-square-foot roof, even in a moderate rainfall region, can collect well over 1,000 gallons of water a year. Not all of it usable, some is lost to runoff and contamination, but enough to matter. She bent scrap aluminum flashing into a gutter channel along the roof's low edge, ran it into a food-grade barrel on cinder blocks, and fit a spigot at the bottom for gravity-fed flow. For filtering, a portable squeeze-style water filter, the kind sold for backpacking trips, cleaned what came through well enough for washing and cooking. It's worth being clear, this isn't municipal water, and it isn't lab-tested, and untreated roof runoff carries real risk. What worked for her doesn't make it safe for anyone else to copy without the same filtering step and the same caution. She kept a running list on paper as she went because she wanted to know the real number, not a guess. The shed itself, $10. The rust converter that stopped the decay before it could spread further, about $6. Primer, paint, silicone, rivets, a handful of dollars each, some of it free or borrowed. The floor materials mostly salvaged, with the plywood as the single largest cost at $20. The heater, secondhand, around $12. The solar panel, $15. The battery, $19. Bought used with no warranty. The carbon monoxide detector, $9. Total door-to-door, floor-to-ceiling, heat, light, and water included. a little over $140, and roughly 11 weeks of steady physical labor. That number shouldn't produce what it produced. A sealed, insulated, heated, lit room with running water for under $200 sounds impossible next to what most of us have been taught a home should cost. But the arithmetic isn't wrong. What's wrong is the assumption that a mortgage, a credit check, and a permit process are the only path between a person and four walls that hold heat. That's not a policy argument. This structure doesn't meet building code. The wiring wouldn't pass an inspection. The water isn't tested by a lab. It sits on land she doesn't legally own. She knows all of that. She isn't pretending otherwise, and neither should we. Here's the piece of this that's easy to skip past. She didn't scrap that shed and start from nothing. She looked at something everyone else had written off as finished, and instead of replacing it, changed what it was, one layer at a time. The rust conversion is the clearest version of that idea, because you can watch it happen with your own eyes. The acid doesn't scrape away the damage. It doesn't hide it under a fresh coat of something else. It reaches into the decay itself and rearranges it into something stable. The exact same iron atoms in a different protective arrangement. The thing that was failing becomes the thing holding everything else up. She said that somewhere around the third or fourth week, she stopped thinking of the shed as something she was fixing and started thinking of it as something she was becoming, which is a strange thing to say about a piece of corrugated steel, but it's the truest sentence she's offered about the whole process. It's worth sitting with that for a second longer than feels comfortable, because it's the actual engine underneath every choice that followed. Nothing here required starting over. It required refusing to throw away something that still had a use left in it. $10 for the shed. A rust converter to stop the decay before building on top of it. A raised, insulated floor to stop the ground from stealing body heat. Insulated, sealed walls and ceiling to hold whatever warmth came next. A small secondhand heater sized for a space this small. Solar power for light. A roof-fed water system with basic filtration. A little over $140 total. And 11 weeks of consistent physical work. Nothing in that list is exotic. Nothing requires a permit, a loan, or a contractor. It requires knowing the correct order to solve problems in, and being willing to do the work yourself for as long as it takes. If a build like this raises more questions than it answers for you, that's the right reaction to have. Say where you'd want to see this go further in the comments. And if you want more of these documented properly, before they disappear, subscribing is genuinely how that happens.